Hi, my name is Jeff Vaughn. I am co-author with Tim Martin of Beyond Creation Science. This is the reprise edition of the talk I gave at the Covenant Creation Conference. The original was lost, so we have to record from scratch. You may have heard earlier that Mark Chiacara said that he didn't believe you could get covenant creation without reference to preterism, without reference to covenant eschatology. Well, I beg to differ, and this is an attempt to find a way to do that. I'm going to be looking at the history, how the ancients actually thought of their own creation stories. We can compare those to Genesis 1. Next slide. In the beginning, God created what? This is the question we have to ask. Covenant creation gives one answer. Historically, Christianity has given us another answer. Next slide. The common assumption today is that Genesis 1 is a literal description of the creation of the physical universe. Common views like young earth creationism, day age, the gap theory assume a one-to-one correspondence between Scripture and a true physical description of creation. This is called concordism. Concordism is the view that the biblical account of creation, when properly understood, will be in agreement with the scientific accounts of natural history. Here's an example from one of my favorite concordist books. Day 1. About 15 to 20 billion years ago. Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. God created matter, space, and time. Then about 4.5 billion years ago, Genesis 1:2. Now the earth was formless and empty, darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. The matter from which God formed our earth and solar system comprised a shapeless nebula in dark space. God set to work on it to accomplish His intentions. Genesis 1:3. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Also about 4.5 billion years ago, sunlight became visible from Earth at this time. At some point, God caused the sun to ignite, quite literally, as a giant continuously burning hydrogen bomb. This verse may either refer to this or when God cleared some of the nebular dust away. Notice a one-to-one correspondence. We have a verse of Scripture. We have a scientific fact that's paired with it. Next slide. The primary concordist views are young earth creationism, which has been dominant since about 1970, day age and gap theory, which shared the podium from the 1600s to the 1960s. And then there's a less common one, but it is the most literal of all, Fisher's theistic evolution. What do these views have in common? These views try to find concordance, that is, agreement, harmony, similarity, or correspondence on a verse-by-verse basis between Scripture and the facts of physical creation. Each concordist view tends to be all or nothing. Either the view is true or it is false. If a given view is true, the other concordist views are false. The earth can't be 6,000 years old and the gap theory be true. These views are literal and therefore can't allow contradictions. There is another class of views that is called, any wild guesses? Slide 7, please. Non-concordist. These views see Genesis as something other than a literal description of the physical creation. Each of these views either denies or it is at least separate from the literal physicalness of the events, at least in modern terms. There's Klein's literary framework view, Milton Terry's apocalyptic view, the Presbyterian analogic days view, There's the early church prophetic days view and Wiseman's prophetic days view. Lightfoot and Sailhammer have a local creation view. That's Lightfoot from the 1600s who gave a date of creation. He and Ussher often used by young earthers as support for their view. There's Walton's ancient Near East view. John Walton refers to the creation account as the creation of God's cosmic temple. There's Don Stoner's ancient writing view that you saw a glimpse of in his presentation earlier. Some forms of theistic evolution, and of course, covenant creation. Slide 8. Each of these views recognizes a feature of the text that should not be taken in concordance with physical creation. Features such as the literary structure, the apocalyptic nature, the common use of analogy in Scripture, the prophetic symbolism, the emphasis of function, the physically restricted form, comparison to A&E literature and A&E archaeology, that's ancient Near East, the general or total failure to reconcile the text to science, and the covenant purpose of the text. Next slide. Each non-concordist view offers something that illuminates the text in addition to what the other views offer. If a given non-concordist view is true, the other views may still be true, and likely many of them are true. Modern Christians are generally not aware of the long histories of non-concordist views. Non-concordist views don't match our modern expectations. Modern Christians tend to outright deny the validity of non-concordist views. That's allegorical. You believe it's a myth, etc. These are things that preterists have heard on the other end of the Bible numerous times. Yet non-concordist views all work and work together, focusing on separate, important issues in the text. As young earth creationism dies, non-concordist views will finally get a fair hearing. We don't have time to compare all these non-concordist views, so I thought I'd try a different approach. Slide 12. In answer to the question, in the beginning God created what, we should first try to settle, is the creation account meant to be concordist or non-concordist? Next slide. How can we answer that question? Scripture may not directly help. If the writers assumed concordism, they might not have assumed the same version of concordism we see. If the writers assumed non-concordism, they might have assumed the analogies are obvious. They would have been obvious to their culture, but not necessarily to us. That we have so much disagreement throughout history shows we cannot determine the answer from Scripture alone. We need to try to understand the culture that produced the Bible. We need a clear example from history about how the ancients read their creation documents. The history of diplomatic immunity provides the first example. Diplomatic immunity is a form of legal immunity and a policy held between governments which ensures that diplomats are given safe passage and are considered not susceptible to lawsuit or prosecution under the host country's laws, although they can be expelled. Diplomatic immunity comes from the principle that an individual is under the law of his country. He has no formal rights or protection under the country he is visiting. Slide 15. In ancient times, a traveler to a foreign country was not under the law of the country he visited. He was not protected. Law was a function of the covenant you were born under. For example, each Greek city-state had its own patron god or goddess. Typically, that city-state had its own creation story where that god created the city, the first citizens, and the law. We call these creation stories cosmologies because we believe they describe the Greek view of the universe. But do they? Are these creation stories cosmologies, or do they describe something else? Next slide, please. Before the time of Christ, Plato and Aristotle developed a true cosmology. Plato recognized that you can't get from here to infinity. Therefore, he reasoned you can't get from infinity to here. The universe and time were created. Aristotle called this creator the unmoved mover. This was the uncreated creator, the unknown God. Many of Aristotle's followers saw no need for an unmoved mover and developed the cosmology further, developing an eternal universe. And this universe developed into Ptolemy's model, which stood uncontested for 1,500 years. Columbus, Copernicus, Galileo, and Kepler took the first chunks out of it. Physicists finally gave up the last parts as a result of the Cobe experiments in the 1990s. The rest of the world has yet to abandon the last vestiges of Aristotle's reign. Slide 17. The unknown God became a placeholder for whatever god or gods actually existed but were unknown to the Greeks. The Apostle Paul recognized the unknown God as the creator of the physical universe in Acts 6:17. But what is important here is neither Plato, Aristotle, nor their followers ascribed physical creation to any of the gods of the pantheon, the gods of the Greek creation stories. The unknown God created the physical universe, but the gods created the individual city-states. Next slide, please. Plato, Aristotle, and their followers did not see the Greek creation stories as describing physical creation. They believed the creation stories and used them when discussing law, morals, rights, and duties of a citizen, but they ignored the creation stories when they discussed physical creation. With respect to their own traditions, Plato and Aristotle were non-concordists. The creation accounts were the basis of covenant and law. This was the understanding in Greece and essentially all of the Roman Empire from before Plato until at least the 1st century. Augustine, it appears, was the first to consciously attach a creation account to a cosmology, specifically Genesis 1 to Aristotle's cosmology. Next slide, please. So, in answer to the question, in the beginning, God created what? Plato and Aristotle's answer? In the beginning, God created the city-state, the first citizens, and the law. Now, this answer is foreign to us. Our answer, a concordist answer, would be foreign to them. Slide 20. Let's put this in practical first-century terms. It is AD 50. You are the citizen of a Gentile city. Your city had a patron god, a law delivered by that patron, and a creation story. When you went abroad, you were still under the protection of your own law. You had no rights in the new city and no protection. If you became a Christian, you had to denounce your city's patron. No more worship of Athena or Diana. You traded your creation story for the creation story of Genesis. You renounced your citizenship and your rights as a citizen. You renounced your protection under the law. Now, this may not have been a formal declaration, but it is effectively what happened when you were born again. Officially, you were now an atheist. You had no God and no law to protect you. Next slide. From Acts 6 on, wherever the disciples went, the Jews followed, trying to kill the disciples. The Jews went from town to town and persecuted the church. How could they do this? Didn't they have laws? Saul's purpose for going to Damascus was to persecute the church. Acts 13 in Antioch, the Jews persecuted the church. Acts 14 in Iconium and Lystra, Acts 17 in Thessalonica and Berea, Acts 18 in Corinth, Acts 20 in Greece, etc. The Jews went from town to town and persecuted the church. If you were a Jewish Christian, you were an alien and not protected. You were expected to conform to Jewish law, and the Jews could judge you. If you were a Greek Christian, you had renounced your citizenship for a Jewish God. You were now Jewish. And again, you were expected to conform to Jewish law, or the Jews could judge you. Next slide. This persecution was possible only because of the legal system back then. The city creation story was a legal covenant that defined who was in and who was out. It said nothing about physical creation. The citizens had rights, the non-citizens had none. This was certainly the view of the creation text in ancient Greece and most of the Roman world for about 500 years. But Genesis 1 is 6,000 years old. Did the people who wrote even earlier believe what we believe today? Or did they believe what people believed 2,000 years ago? We can't know for sure, but we do have some ancient law codes we can compare. The law code of Hammurabi appears to start with a creation account. Here's what Claude Herman Walter Johns said in the 11th edition of Encyclopedia Britannica back in 1910. The god of a city was originally owner of its land, which encircled it with an inner ring of irrigable, arable land and an outer fringe of pasture. And the citizens were his tenants. The god and his vice-regent, the king, had long ceased to disturb tenancy, and were content with fixed dues in naturalia, stock, money, or service. A little later, the temple occupied a most important position. It received from its estates, from tithes and other fixed dues, as well as from the sacrifices, a customary share, and other offerings of the faithful, vast amounts of all sorts of naturalia, besides money and permanent gifts. The larger temples had many officials and servants. Originally, perhaps, each town clustered round one temple, and each head of a family had a right to minister there and share its receipts. You can see here, in John's view of the Hammurabi Code and law codes in general, we're discussing God decreeing himself as the owner of the land and defining his law, what's owed to him, his allegiance owed to him, taxes and such, and citizenship. Each head of a family had the right to minister there and share its receipts. Let's now look at the prologue of Hammurabi's Code. Hammurabi's Code was written around the time of Abraham, some 4,000 years ago. It was written in a language called Akkadian. Akkadian is considered to be the parent language of Hebrew and is likely the language of Abraham. Slide 24. When Anu the Sublime, king of the Anunnaki, and Bel, the Lord of heaven and earth, who decreed the fate of the land, assigned to Marduk, the overruling son of E, God of righteousness, dominion over earthly man, and made him great among the Igigi. They called Babylon by his illustrious name, made it great on earth, and founded an everlasting kingdom in it, whose foundations were laid so solidly as those of heaven and earth. Then Anu and Bel called by name me, Hammurabi, the exalted prince who feared God to bring about the rule of righteousness in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evildoers, so that strong should not harm the weak, so that I should rule over the black-headed people like Shamash, and enlighten the land to further the well-being of mankind. Now you may want to go back and forth between the next slide and this one for comparison. Notice the words that are common with Genesis 1. The original is Akkadian, as I've mentioned before, the parent language of Hebrew, and it shares much of the Hebrew vocabulary. Now, I've not had much success getting a copy of the Akkadian text. This is the common translation done back in the 1700s. The translator knew it was a law code and may have embellished the translation accordingly. The translation has about 4 times as many words as the original. For example, I've been told that the Akkadian word translated decreed and assigned is not 2 words, but 1 occurrence of 1 word. If we go back and look, who decreed the fate of the land assigned to Marduk. It has this word decreed. Decreed what? Fate's probably not in there. Decreed land Marduk. I wish I had a full text that I could read. Now, this Akkadian word, decreed and assigned, I've been told is equivalent to the Hebrew word bara, which is translated create in Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created, God decreed, God assigned heaven and earth. The prologue to Hammurabi's law code might be an ancient creation account. Finally, slide 26. The ancients at the time of Christ had a non-concordist view of their own creation accounts. It wasn't the physical universe, it was their own covenant, their own law, their own city-state patron God. The ancient law codes from before Christ appear to have started with a creation account, which demonstrates concordism. So, a non-concordist view has a strong basis. It needs to be considered heavily in the future. And it should make a note, there is only one non-concordist view of eschatology: covenant, creation, and preterism in general. Thank you.